the state's economy. We are going to have a briefing this afternoon at 2 o'clock for AGC members on Zoom about that. We'll be sending another update in a moment because they've just posted a frequently asked questions document, and it will contain the information to be able to register for the briefing on the new guidance and safety guidelines and other related documents that they've published. I'd strongly encourage you to participate or have somebody from your firm participate. This is new. The AGC staff's got about a 20-minute advantage on all of you, and having seen it, that's about how long it was from when it posted to when we got it out. So we'll kind of be working through it together, but I would encourage you to register for that. Space is limited. We can accommodate up to 500 people. We're at about 200 now. So if you've not signed up for that yet, I would encourage you to do so ASAP. With that, I will turn the microphone over to Brendan Manning to introduce the panel. Brendan?
Great, thank you, Mike. I just wanted to go over a couple little housekeeping items. We are going to go through the presentation today, and we will be taking questions as well. There are a couple different methods of doing that. Down at the bottom of your screen, or based on what you're looking at, you should have a chat box. You'll be able to type a question in there, as well as we'll have the ability to unmute you. Everyone is muted at this time other than the hosts. And if you click under participants, for a lot of you that may have a PC-based laptop or connection, there is a spot to be able to basically raise your hand. You have the ability to raise your hand, and it allows us to then unmute you, and we can we'll unmute you and ask mention your name, and you can then ask the question of the panel at that point. So those are a couple ways that you can ask questions today. Again, we're going to wait till the end to do that. If you have something that you want to put up prior to, that would be fine as well. We'll get to them at the very end. So with that, what I will do is actually turn this over to Joe Hogan. Joe is our Vice President of Building Services. And if you want to introduce Barrett and Charlie today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Hogan, Vice President for Building for AGC of New York State. We're really pleased to put this program on today. It's kind of an adjunct, if you will, to one we did a few weeks ago on some of the contractual issues. But this gets into how do you actually measure the impact on a project, and we're very, very pleased to be joined by a great panel of Charlie Boland, principal at GREYHAWK, and Barrett Richards, senior managing consultant for GREYHAWK. I won't go into reading their bios. You can see them on the screen now, and this will be shared later on and available for the participants to have this PowerPoint afterwards. I'm listed as a moderator here, so but by and large, we've been having a great deal of discussion, you and Charlie, Barrett, and myself, and so I think for the most part, I'm going to stay out of the way, and as I think they're going to do a spectacular job in this presentation. Every once in a while, I may interject. One thing that I will note, Mike mentioned about the guidance that came out last evening, and we're still, as he said, digesting it and figuring out exactly what it means. One of the intended or unintended pieces there that I think has an impact or could potentially have an impact is that the purpose, if you look at the guidance, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, but if you look at the purpose of it, it's directed primarily, first and foremost, at owners and operators, and then of construction projects, and their employees and contractors. So from a contractual standpoint, there are issues dealing with who takes the responsibility on certain points. Does that have to be a contractual change? It's a particular note if you're dealing with a WICS law, multiple prime contract job, and what's going to happen down the road with that in new contracts with this in place. So there's some interesting questions that come into play, and being able to measure these impacts and measure these issues, I think, become very, very important. So with that, I will turn it over to Charlie and Barrett to take it from here. Gentlemen?
Very good. Well, thank you, Mike, Brendan, and Joe, and appreciate the AGC allowing us this forum to, present some insights on quantifying the impacts related to COVID. And before I get started, I just wanted to give you a little thumbnail about GREYHAWK's perspective here. GREYHAWK provides consulting services to all stakeholders in the construction arena. So we work for contractors, subcontractors, owners, designers. So we understand the perspective of all the stakeholders, and it's from that perspective that we are talking about the quantification effort. So with that as a backdrop for perspective, our goal here today is it's going to be it's a broad goal. We can't get into a lot of detail in the time frame that we have, but our goal is to broaden your perspective on the extent of COVID impact. Some of you that are working on essential projects are already experiencing it. Those that are not will be soon. And in addition to understanding what those impacts are, we're going to give some guidance on best practices on how to quantify it. So beyond what we have here in the presentation, as Brenda mentioned, we will have time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. And beyond that, if there's any questions that aren't answered, Barrett and I will be available to deal with them. So the governor has issued a directive, and I think it's the New York Forward is the prescription on how things are going to be opening. So the economy, as well as construction throughout the country and in New York in particular, will resume. Will reopen and resume. And there are and will be significant impacts from COVID. And those impacts start out with the disruptions that are being caused by COVID, by the shutdown of projects, the suspension or cancellation of projects. These new protocols for regulations to work are going to be disruptive and have been disruptive, and the ongoing health concerns are going to be very disruptive to the industry. And these disruptions will manifest themselves in impacts to project time and cost. So what we're going to do today is go over a handful of these impacts and talk in some detail about them, and then how best to quantify the time and cost impacts flowing from them. So first order of business would be if you've got a project that was stopped, you're going to be remobilizing. The project may be mothballed or may be canceled. So we'll talk about some of those dynamics. There will be significant productivity losses. That is the elephant in the room. With all the restrictions that are being placed upon the ability to get back to work, it's going to affect the output that you're going to get from your input. So it's really going to be a serious component of the time and cost impacts. Beyond that, you're going to have to look at subcontractor commitments. These work stoppages have had a serious impact on small businesses, and your subcontractors or subcontractors out there are getting hurt. So that's going to be something that needs to be considered. Supply chain is going to be a big issue. Whether it's getting deliveries domestically or internationally, whether you source your material or equipment domestically or internationally, there's going to be impacts. Getting it to the site may have impacts. So it's not just like you can turn the switch and continue work. There's going to be a lot of things to consider when you are planning your restart and getting ready for that. And all of these issues are going to impact your schedule. It's going to take more time. So you need to be aware of that and be as active as possible, identifying what those impacts are, detailing them in a schedule, and being able to demonstrate that impact so all stakeholders know what they're looking at as we restart. Owners are going to want to know, what's the impact? What, how bad is the hurt here? And I know there's always a tendency for contractors to want to please their owners, and that's understandable. But it's key not to make unrealistic promises to your owner client coming out of this shutdown. And owners want to hear the truth. So let's be as clear and concise as possible. Speaking to some of our clients about restarting, and one client was saying, we were already behind when this hit. I really want to make get this done as soon as possible. And I said, well, take a good look at what you're dealing with, because you don't want to overpromise in that situation or in any situation. So we're going to go through some of the things to consider in each of these areas of impact. And unfortunately, in addition to dealing with all of these impacts, we're advocating that you take the extra step to specifically quantify them, and that's going to take even more effort. But it's effort that I believe is going to be well worth it, because without it, the path to getting relief that you're entitled to will be more difficult. So you move to the next slide. We'll talk about the keys to quantifying. Back one. There, backwards. There we go. There we go. So these keys here that are listed on this slide may seem fundamental, but you'd be surprised how many times these necessary steps get overlooked or shortchanged. The foundation of any change request, REA, or claim is based on proofs of liability, causation, and damages. And we liken that to a three-legged stool, and you need all three legs to keep the stool up, and that would be the claim or the REA or the change order request. So the first aspect of that is the liability side. So you need to understand what your contract says. Carefully consider the clauses. And as Joe mentioned in the introduction, AGC did a webinar back, I believe it was April 1st, with contract issues in the age of COVID. And I would point the audience to that presentation for input on addressing whether you're going to look at force majeure, look at notice requirements, look at suspensions, subcontractor, supplier, vendor issues from a contractual standpoint. It's important that you start off with a solid liability argument for any request for change. And also looking at your, for the general contractors, looking at your upstream contract with your owner client, as well as your downstream contracts, to make sure that the requirements of both of those agreements are being addressed appropriately. And so then the next step would be timely identifying the impacts. And we'll go through the next slide. We'll be talking about some of the impacts that we've just created a laundry list of potential impacts. And we'll go through those, but it's important that the impacts are timely identified, so you can start to capture all the documentation you need to memorialize what they are. And once you know what they are, you need to give notification of those impacts, and definitely just follow your contract on the prescription for that. But those notifications should be timely, and they should be not one-off. You can go and say, we're impacted by COVID, here's the notice, and that could be it. I would err on the side of providing a more active notice of ongoing impacts, because you may know some from the beginning, but you're not going to know them all. And as they crop up, it's important to get them out there, get the notification out there for lots of reasons, not the least of which is you need to capture the information, and the owner needs to know, what's coming down the pipe. You don't want to wait until the end and say, this was an impact also, but I didn't tell you about it. So it's going to be important to keep those notifications coming as further impacts are identified.
On that point, I think it's also important to point out that don't get hung up on whether or not you're able to entirely quantify the time and the cost impacts or the time and the cost disruptions of an impact. The important thing here is getting the notice in, and usually the contractors review your contracts. They'll state, hey, you have so many days to get in a more developed package together, but getting that notice in within those time frames is very important.
Good point, Bart. And then regarding the impacts, all of your contracts are going to have a duty to mitigate. It's a challenge, but once you identify those impacts, it's how can we work around it at the least cost impact, and that's a challenge that we're the entire industry is dealing with. So there is going to be a duty to mitigate. It can't just be I was hurt by this, I'm going to just pay me my impact. We need to make sure we're doing best efforts to mitigate. And so the next would be so that gives you an ability to show causation, dealing with those impacts, what has happened, and then the documentation is going to be key. And I can't tell you how many times that we've been trying to address a change request or an REA or a claim, and the story sounds good, but we don't have documents. And some claims or problems creep up on projects, and you don't know they're there, and you find out about them late. Well, the elephant's in the room here today. We know that COVID is here. It's incumbent upon us to identify what those impacts are and document them real time and continuously. And in today's environment, there really is no excuse not to. The daily records are even more easy to keep. Photographs, videos, webcams, you can capture and document impacts on site a lot easier than you could in the past. And if you need to expend some additional effort or resources to do that, it's important that you do, because if you don't capture it today, it's going to be difficult to capture it 3 weeks from now, because you're doing more things on these projects around COVID, and it's beyond your original scope of work and your original means and methods. So it's going to be challenging. So if you need additional staff to do that, I suggest you employ that and track these changes on an ongoing basis, and also connect these impacts to damages, and we'll talk a little bit about that on future slides. And I think the last bullet point on this slide is critical. As we all know, construction is a very dynamic environment. It's continuously changing, and COVID-19 impacts are likely not the only problem that you're seeing on your project. And COVID-19 is not going to be the absolution for previous problems or mistakes on a project. So it's going to be important to identify, to baseline your project at the time of COVID, to understand where it stood, what was driving it, and then address those other issues as well as COVID going forward. So it's not a throwing everything in the COVID bucket, because those kinds of requests are not looked at very, very kindly. So if we go to the next slide, Barrett. So the impacts. We tried to pull together a bit of a laundry list here. And you know, all the stakeholders are feeling pain. These impacts are varied, and they touch both on-site and off-site issues, direct costs, and impact costs. But just running through a few of these, there may be a concern by the owner for health risks, and they close down the project or close the project because of market concerns. The project's no longer viable. Issues with deliveries are going to be a problem. Number one, can you get the material or equipment that you expected to get at a certain time or not? What's happening off-site with fabrication? Is your curtain wall being fabricated timely? Your steel? Are materials available? Those issues are going to, those areas are going to need to be checked. Once the equipment or materials get to site, the unloading and shaking out process is going to differ from what you're used to. Are you ready for that? Worker illness, that's going to be an issue. Going to be testing workers, and if they're sick, they're going to have to be sent home. How's that going to impact your ability to do work? You're going to have an adequate labor force. Looking at other outside issues, getting permits. What's the status of the regulatory agencies in your area? Can you get a permit? Can you get inspections? And then the social distancing measures. You're going to have a learning curve with your labor force. Business as usual is gone for a while. How long is we don't know quite yet, but there's going to be a learning curve. Moving around the site's going to be difficult. If you've got a building, a high rise, vertical transportation, getting to your work area. There's going to be limitations of how many folks can be in an elevator, in a lift. So those kinds of disruptions are going to have to be looked at and quantified, and measures need to be taken to try and mitigate the impact of those. As I go through here, the whole concept of not sharing tools. So, okay, you're going to be cleaning your tools, or you're going to be having to get extra small tools for your workforce. You may need added supervision because of longer or more work days. Maybe you're working staggered shifts. Increase of bond or insurance costs. And what's the deal with your design team? Can they do inspections real time on site? They're going to have to do them remotely. You're walking around with a GoPro to do inspections. So there's a lot to digest here, and a lot to be cognizant of. So with that, let's move to the next. And Barrett, why don't you go through the project status changes?
Right, so Charlie's just gone through a laundry list of impacts, and I'm sure many of you have seen impacts on, or saw impacts on that list that you're encountering now, or impacts that you will undoubtedly encounter in the future, and probably many others that we haven't touched on. But rest assured that regardless of the status of a project, these impacts are real. And we'd just like to take a few minutes to go through some of the stages that projects may be at that you're dealing with right now, and some things to keep in mind. And we're going to walk through a scenario where projects being remobilized. The work has been suspended for whatever reason, whether it was for a mandatory quarantine period because someone was diagnosed with the COVID-19 virus, or a an owner or a government agency who said, we got to shut down work, and just recently restrictions have started to be relaxed. So you find yourself in a remobilization situation. A mothball project. It's just like you think about it, it's exactly what the word says. You got the sweater in the closet, you got mothballs in there so you can use it, when the next season comes around. And same thing with the construction project. You got a project that's been suspended for a defined period of time, and you need to plan on, okay, what are we going to do in the interim time so that we can be best equipped to pick up the work and move forward. Then cancel projects. There are going to be those projects where it just doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons to even move forward with the job, and the work has been canceled. And then ongoing projects. This one sticks out a little bit because work has continued and has been allowed to continue, whether it be because it was an essential project or for any of a number of other reasons, but there's still impacts on those projects that are ongoing, that work is continuing. Some of the common steps that need to be taken into consideration as we think about the projects and the different stages that they are. First and foremost is drawing a line in the sand. Where was the schedule and the project costs? Where were they at the time of the disruption? That's a very important point in the life cycle of a project in terms of proving out the extent of damages down the road. And then considering disruptions of suppliers and subcontractors. We've been hearing a lot about issues with supply chain and the solvency of suppliers and subcontractors. Some who, quite frankly, just can't or haven't been able to weather even a few weeks of shutdown. And so that's a very important element that needs to be taken into consideration. Updating field management protocols. We've got social distancing requirements, health checks. Charlie touched on supervision in terms of additional shifts. What if you're not able to have the same size of crews on a site? We may be faced with additional need for supervision because of different requirements that have forced you to have smaller crews than you had anticipated. And then again, we can't reiterate enough the importance of having separate cost codes for not only COVID-19 impacts, but any impacts that you're facing in your projects. It makes it that much easier to prove out entitlement down the road, when you can easily separate and segregate out those costs that are associated with impacts versus contractual costs that you're obligated to incur. And then dedicating resources. This tends to be a pretty common sticking point in terms of incurring the cost and effort to having somebody, or in some cases a team, dedicated to monitoring, to documenting and managing the impacts. But we're talking real money. Charlie walked through the scenarios of hoist impacts and whatnot. Well, you think about it in context of one worker, maybe it's 15 minutes a day. Well, what if you have 50 workers on the site? It quickly adds up, and the burden of documenting that impact is going to be on the one who's putting forward a claim for those additional costs. So we'll walk through some of the situation and circumstances that one might find themselves in, depending on the different stage of a project. So you're back site remobilizing. Well, what about some of the things that hopefully you've been looking at before you've even gotten to this point, like price escalation and collective bargaining agreements, if they're applicable, particularly when it comes to labor rates? Has there been any change there? And hopefully a proactive approach has been taken so that you haven't correspondence with the owner, with the unions and whoever else is involved in these aspects of your project, to start working out who's responsible and how to move forward based on price escalation or increased labor rates that may be applicable. And then this might seem like a Captain Obvious point here, but remobilization costs on a remobilized project. How many times did you plan to remobilize on the project, or just mobilize, period, right? Typically, you mobilize, you got demobilization, not remobilization. So that's a fairly obvious cost that hopefully you're tracking and documenting. What are the site conditions on the project? Again, this goes back to the importance of establishing the baseline condition of the site from a time and a cost perspective, but also the actual physical work in place to commission the site. There may be some additional effort required to get the site back up to a condition where you can resume work. And then when it comes to new or revised regulations, there's a whole litany of requirements that have been issued in terms of what's the expectation is in terms of working on a site. First, it starts with entry to the site. What's going to be required to do health checks and screening? How many people are going to need? What kind of staff? Is it going to be enough to have one person doing health checks? Or do you have so many workers on a site that you need a small team to facilitate that process so it doesn't have a undue impact on the project? It goes back to mitigating the impact, the effect of the impacts. Signage that clearly explain what the new requirements are, what changes are, and having those on the site. And then cleaning, both personnel, equipment, tools. There's been a lot of regulations regarding that and keeping the workforce safe. And then a learning curve. You may think or have a perspective that, hey, our site, because of the logistics and maybe it's a more open site, maybe you're dealing with a highway project or something where there's just more space and your crews are able to more or less function the way they did before. There's still going to be a learning curve in terms of adopting these new or revised regulations, so it's important to keep that in mind as well. Our mothballed project. So for whatever reason, decision has been made to hold off on construction for a period of time. The site will need to be secured. You may need to have a security company that regularly patrols the site to keep unwanted visitors away, make sure there's no unsafe conditions that have developed. What about maintenance of the structure at the site? Equipment maintenance and inspections. We have equipment that's going to be sitting on the site. You have to make sure it's in good working order so that when the project resumes, you can make use of that equipment. And then in storage, maybe a need to have facilities to store, especially when we were talking about supply chain. You may not want to forestall deliveries, but might not be able to accept them at the site. So arrangements for storage of those deliveries off-site may be required as well. And then again, back to contracts and suppliers, vendors, and subcontractors. Visit with them about their contract situation, about just their solvency period. What will it take to suspend work? And in some cases, unfortunately, we may need to talk about terminations of contracts just because it's not practical for someone to sit around for however long the project is going to be mothballed. And it may be in your best interest, the owner's best interest, and also the company where the termination may make sense for them to move on to other projects. Project's been canceled. For whatever reason, the decision has been made that you just shouldn't move forward with the project. Some of the same considerations come into play here as with the mothball project. Making sure the site's secure. What about completing work to a level of completion that will allow the project to be safely abandoned, so to speak? There may be additional work, actual field work, that is required to get the site to a state where it can be abandoned and people can move on. And then again, we talked about the baseline condition, how important it is to establish that. In the case of the canceled projects, it's important to establish at whatever point the project's been canceled, what was the percent complete of construction, and then documenting and archiving that information. And then some of the other things that you typically encounter at the end of a project, whether it's canceled or not, or successfully completed, and that's working through project closeout and demobilizing on the site. So again, some of these costs, like for example, the demobilization, it's probably most of that cost is something that should have been anticipated, but there might be additional efforts that need to be undertaken to demobilize on a canceled project that had not been anticipated under a normal circumstance where the project was completed as a normal course of business.
Barrett and Charlie, this is Joe. Just a question that's come up that I think probably could be clarified or answered. Is the difference between impacts that are compensable versus just excusable relative to schedule? Can you talk about that a little bit? I think largely it probably goes back to the contractual issues, but this may be something that goes over and above. And from my standpoint, with AGC, there's going to be some need to look at some issues of fairness and equity and what make sure that there's some degree of balance here. But nonetheless, that's my standpoint. Barrett and Charlie, thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question, Joe. And that's, I think that any of us that have been listening to, the other webinars about the contract side of the conundrum of, should I go force majeure or should I go suspension? It really depends on your specific contract. The issue with force majeure is typically time, no money. I'm not sure whether in these circumstances, there's going to be challenges to that, I'm sure, legally. But to the greatest extent, it goes back to working with your in-house or outside counsel to find the best clause in your contract that takes advantage of what you signed up for. You may have multiple paths to potential recovery, but a suspension, notice of a suspension of work may be better than going with a force majeure claim on your specific contract. GREYHAWK never offers legal advice. So we are construction professionals and we interpret contracts as construction professionals. But when it comes down to what is the best moving clause, it really hinges on the legal ramifications of that. So I would push that back to counsel. Barrett, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it well. I mean, one thing I would just add too as well, there's a variety of different clauses in contracts typically that address the compensability of an impact or whether it's excusable or not. One other one that comes to mind also, the change order provisions as well. It may not be a case where you need to go to the level of a force majeure suspension or even a termination clause, but you might be able to get some redress through using the change order provision within the contract as well. But yes, definitely confer with your legal counsel on those matters. That question is going to be at the crux of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and truly, it's when we talked about the three-legged stool. It is liability, causation, and damages. I mean, the contractual side, liability side, that needs to be addressed head on, because if that's a weak leg in the stool, you may have good causation and supportable damages, but if your path to get there through the contract is weak, the submission is going to be weak. So all those components need to be as strong as possible. So your submission is as strong as possible.
Thank you.
Good.
And then to what seemed to be somewhat of an outlier, the ongoing project. So work has continued, but there's still impacts. Undoubtedly, social distancing has caused changes to the way that the workers are both working and moving about the site. Considerations for additional supervision and the way that supervision is being deployed across the site. All these things are impacts on projects, even those that have continued through this period of time. Again, just going back, and we'll continue to go back to addressing disruptions to suppliers and subcontractors. Some projects have numerous subcontractors and suppliers involved, so it's important to have open, real-time conversations with all the parties that are involved. especially on ongoing projects, to see what kind of impacts they're experiencing, so that doesn't ripple up to where you are, whether you're a general contractor or even from an owner's perspective as well. They address it head on. While we deal with a lot of litigation situations, our preference is to get involved real time, because that's where real, I think, beneficial action can be taken, and it's more likely that a project is going to be able to be successfully completed to the satisfaction of both those on the contracting side and those on the ownership side too. It's rarely, if ever, a good idea to wait till the end to sort it all out. It's nothing but a mess at that point. And then, changes to the project schedule. I think one of the things that comes to mind when I think about ongoing projects is, in the midst of adopting these new and revised regulations, not to lose sight of the fact that, hey, we've got a time frame that we're working to here. We need to incorporate, not just incorporate so much the impacts into the schedule, but remember that those impacts are what should be dictating the schedule, not the other way around, and trying to force a round peg into a square hole there when it comes to the schedule. So thinking and making changes to the project schedule is important. And then the other items applied as they did on the other projects at the different stages that we have gone through, in terms of what the field implications are in terms of the disruptions that we're seeing. Now, speaking of protocols and regulations, probably the most important thing to keep in mind here, and it's already been touched on at the beginning of this presentation, the introduction that Mike and Joe gave. We had new regulations, new information come out last night, and it's going to continue to come in with some regularity, but it's going to come in also in drips and drabs. So it's going to be important to keep on top of the protocols and the regulations, and be as quick to identify and implement those changes as possible, so that learning curve can be as efficient as possible. Especially here in the New York metro area, one of the single largest cost components of a project is labor. So making sure that whatever needs to be done in terms of revisions to operating procedures on a site, that they can be implemented as quickly and as efficiently as possible, is going to save on those labor costs, and it's going to benefit everyone. Some impacts to quantify and keep in mind: the owner and government restrictions, cost of new or revised regulations in terms of meeting them and the efforts that need to be taken. On-site testing, again, at arrival or periodically during the day. What about visitors who come, or agencies who come to do inspections, and architects and engineers and subcontractors coming and going throughout the day? Can't have a tunnel vision on this and thinking, all right, it's just at 7 o'clock in the morning when we start and 4 o'clock when we end, that we've got to be monitoring the workflow. It's got to be going on throughout the day to differing extents. It changes to the working hours and shifts. What's that going to do to supervision? What about inefficiencies that will be encountered as well in working non-regular work hours or working overtime? Those are very real costs. And then the responsiveness and ability of designers, engineers, and others in government agencies to do inspections. It's real. Charlie touched on, is this going to be something where physical site visit can be made, or is somebody going to be relying on somebody who's on site walking around with a GoPro? How appropriate is that going to be? And what about shop witness tests that aren't even on site, but they may be at a facility that's in an area where restrictions haven't been lifted yet? So those are real considerations that need to be taken in mind. And then the associated costs and time impacts that need to be quantified. So moving on to what I just mentioned in terms of one of the most prevalent and most impactful elements when it comes to project impacts, and that is productivity. And labor productivity has and will change to one degree or another. So this is where we will spend the majority of our time in terms of the presentation going forward.
Okay, so productivity. Well, it's a term thrown around a lot. So, you know, in the basic form, you know, productivity is the ratio of inputs versus outputs. It's cubic yards of concrete per man hour, lineal feet of conduit per man hour. At the bottom line here, it's going to take more input to achieve the same output. And the question is going to be how much? So labor productivity is very sensitive to these COVID-19 disruptions, particularly with the cost of labor in the New York metropolitan area, as Barrett mentioned. So seemingly minor changes, such as the checking in, the health check on the way in, and the frequency of the health checks could have a compounding impact on productivity. Mentioned also site logistics, getting to and from your work location. If you can't be you know, shoved like sardines into the man lift, you know, it's going to take more cycles to get workforce to the area for work. So depending on how many workers you have on the site, that can be some real significant impact. So the challenge here is to achieve as efficient labor productivity as you can in these conditions. And it's going to be a give and take between owners and contractors and subcontractors and contractors. So again, it's the elephant in the room. It's everybody should know about it, but in order to understand, you know, what each stakeholder is experiencing, you're going to have good real-time communications. Don't assume that your sub's going to be back with a full labor force and everything that they need to move forward. That may not be the case, and it's incumbent upon each stakeholder to communicate their view of the impacts to their contracting party. So, and you know, we've talked about these impacts that need to be quantified, and you know, these are the ones that I think are most impactful. You know, to and from the site, working at the site with the new restrictions. So you could have a serious learning curve. Doing work the way it usually is done is not going to be the case for a while. The cleaning aspects, unavailability of staff, the coordination aspects, whether these impacts have pushed your overall project into an unfavorable weather position. I mean, were you supposed to be done with you know, closure of your building in November, and now it's looking like January or February? Well, that's going to be an impact that you're going to need to quantify. It's not something that hit you today, but it pushed your schedule into a bad position. And then acceleration. I mean, you know, the projects have a pro forma. They want to get finished on a certain point in time because it makes monetary sense. So there may be a need or desire to, you know, accelerate these projects in the face of COVID, and you know, that needs to be identified as far as productivity goes as well. So if we run to the next slide. So loss of productivity change orders are among the more difficult change orders for an owner to accept. And that's partially due to the fact that, you know, often contractors will use anecdotal evidence to present a bit of a storytelling narrative that attempts to explain, you know, the why, how, and to what degree their productivity has been adversely impacted by a situation, instead of using data-based metrics that analytically demonstrate, you know, what that negative impact on work productivity really is. And the fact that we know there are going to be impacts to productivity from COVID gives you a heads up that you need to identify and document what they are in order to be in the best position to communicate what they are and how drastic they are. And that's going to be important for all stakeholders to know, and to know as soon as possible, so owners can make business decisions about how they want to proceed. So it's going to be a lot of work in a short period of time to essentially re-estimate some of these jobs to see really what you're talking about. So we've identified several methodologies here. And again, before I get to those, I'm going to drive home the fact that, you know, the supportability of a loss of productivity request is going to really turn on, you know, the supportability of the data that supports it. Actual performance is always preferred, or some supportable project data. Hypotheticals are not going to be looked at as favorably as hard facts. So I just throw that out there as a observation. So we're going to talk about several methodologies for quantifying these losses in productivity, and you'll potentially be dealing with, you know, multiple of these methods depending on where your project was. Let's say it was suspended as you're restarting. You know, where was your project? You know, were you in the, if it was a building project, were you in the excavation and foundations area? So you had, you know, not as many workers on the site. Were you, you know, going through superstructure and enclosure, or were you roughed in and closed in and doing rough in and MEP and finishes work? So, you know, those dynamics are going to determine which of these methods, or multiple of these methods, that you end up using in trying to understand and calculate your impact. So let's move to the next slide. So so the actual project documentation, use of that for demonstrating productivity losses is a very helpful and impactful method. It goes to, you know, real documents, your bid information, the baseline schedule and updates that hopefully specifically document your status on the project. Photos, webcams, all the project daily information that you have. I mean, this is it's fact, and hopefully prior to the shutdown or the impact, the COVID impacts, you had this documentation in place. You had this information captured. If you did, you're in a much better position than you otherwise would be. If you didn't, I suggest you take steps to whatever it takes. Add some staff for this. Add some junior staff that will be charged with, you know, documenting labor productivity. Just taking status of, you know, how many workers are working and what their progress is per day or what their progress is per week. But we need to know what the input is and what the output is in order to demonstrate through actual project documentation, you know, what your productivity losses are. So, and then moving on to measured mile. The measured mile is a industry recognized and accepted method for identifying impacts. It's comparing work done during an unimpacted period to work done during an impacted period, and that comparison allows you to demonstrate what the impact is. In its basic form, you know, the measured mile would be used for work that was ongoing at the time of the COVID shutdown, and that will demonstrate, what your productivity was pre-COVID. And now as the restart occurs, you'll be able to demonstrate what your productivity is post, and the difference will be, the impact from COVID. Now, assuming there are no other impacts along the way, if all of a sudden there was a design issue that crept up on this matter, that needs to be taken into consideration. But the measured mile is a very good method for identifying impacts to ongoing work. It's been around for a while. I know I did my first measured mile analysis in 1983. And GREYHAWK's going to be putting out some directive on measured mile vis-a-vis COVID in the not too distant future. But some of the keys for application of measured mile, because this method's been used extensively and I must say abused by certain folks in the way it's applied. But in its best form, it compares. It has to be comparable work between two work periods. You can't be talking about. Let's talk about electrical. You can't be talking about productivity in installing conduit, and then talk about productivity and compare that to productivity for either pulling wire or making terminations. I mean, the work has to be comparable in order for the measured mile to be effective. And then even with the benefit of measured mile as well is it sort of takes bid error out of the equation. I mean, reasonableness of bid is always a question, but if you bid X and your productivity was X plus 10%, well, maybe your bid was off by 10%, but at least you have a baseline of what you were able to achieve. So, bid may not be so much of a factor here. Again, that the work needs to be of similar type, nature, and complexity. You can't be mixing and matching. Like forming and pouring can't be, forming can't be compared to pouring because there's a different level of complexity and level of effort. So measure mile is a good approach. It's been well recognized, but it has to be used properly or it will be challenged and less effective. So next, Barrett, why don't you talk about some project-specific comparison studies?
Sure. So say you find yourself in a situation where it isn't as clean of a scenario as would typically be needed to apply a measure mile analysis, where you have an unimpacted period that you're comparing to an impacted period. What do you do then? Well, one possible option is to use project-specific information. And so in these circumstances, the information that's being used is derived from the productivity that was actually achieved on a project. So one of the options here is to look at comparable work. Find, based on whatever work scope that you're doing as a contractor, you find a least impacted period of time and compare that to the more impacted period of time. So it's a variation on the measured mile method, but it allows for the use of project-specific information. And then if there's trouble or difficulties in doing it based on the work performed by a contractor, if there are different contractors performing similar scopes of work, there's an option there as well, depending on the documentation that's available, to compare the performance of the two contractors. We would try to quantify the impact of labor inefficiencies. Now, if the information on a project for a particular scope of work, or even the work that's performed by different contractors, is difficult or doesn't lend itself to being able to do a productivity analysis, possibly using the comparable work from other projects is an option. This arguably is more applicable to contractors who are doing the same type of work over and over again. Say maybe a highway contractor who specializes in a particular type of work, whether it be bridges or actual roadways. They could possibly compare the work between two different projects. Now, the key with both of these, with these scenarios of using project-specific information, is the availability of information and also the appropriateness of comparing the different work scopes. It's very important to make sure that they're comparable enough so as an argument can't be made that it's impractical or just unreasonable to compare the work in terms of productivity and efficiencies. Another option is what we refer to here as being a time and motion study. Charlie had mentioned the scenario of just moving workers across and around a site. Think about a hoist and some of the restrictions now that are on a hoistway. Say at the outset of a project, it was reasonable and it was actually a case where it was assumed you were going to be able to get maybe half a dozen or so workers into a hoist at one time to get them up and down a building. Well, due to restrictions, some of the guidance that I have seen has limited that to 2, and in some cases 1 worker at a time. So comparing those situations in terms of a time and motion study can be helpful. Also, we had a project where we made use of webcams that were positioned at a site, and we're taking pictures on a fairly regular basis every 15 minutes. And part of our effort involved taking a look at steel deliveries. And we were able to go through methodically, and it took some effort to do this, the webcam information, and track and tabularize the steel deliveries and see if in fact steel deliveries, the timing and the time required to do so, to accept those deliveries, were consistent or not with what the bid assumptions were. It was very helpful in terms of helping our client in that regard. So there's a variety of different ways that you can take advantage of the information that's already there and exists on a project if other methods prove to be impractical. And then next, and as you see, there's an order here. You start out with the more the advantageous methods to use, and more industry accepted in terms of measured mile, and then using project specific information, and then we go to our industry studies. Now, the industry studies should be used very cautiously. There are many sources of information that are recognized throughout the industry in terms of quantifying the factors of different impacts. But they're generally used when there's an absence of or limitation in the actual project data that's available. So again, we can't stress enough the advantage of using actual project data and maintaining that data so it can be used in situations like what we are faced with now in terms of quantifying the impacts. But in the absence of that information, there are avenues that can be used, and using these industry studies is one of those avenues. Now, in terms of using industry studies, it's important to acknowledge here that COVID-19 is introducing some very unique impacts. So it's important to make sure that careful consideration and application is done in terms of using industry studies, so that there isn't an overreach in terms of applying a particular factor when it's wholly inappropriate to do so because of the unique impact that COVID-19 has had on the project. Some of the data that is out there and has been developed is available through the MCAA, through NECA, and there was at one point a guide, an impact evaluation guide that was maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is no longer published, but we do see that surface every once in a while. But again, just note that it's no longer published, so it's best to defer to those resources that are available that are maintained on an ongoing and regular basis. We also note here the use of estimating guides. There's a variety of different organizations that are out there that produce cost estimating information for construction projects. And these studies they're based on surveys of the construction industry. So they are recognized, and it's appropriate to use that information. And they tend to be less subject to criticism when used, but they do need to be used appropriately. I've spent a fair amount of my career using these cost estimating guides to calculate the cost of construction. And when I first started out, I thought it was simply a matter of taking, say, a pipe wrench. All right, I got to go find 10 feet of 2-inch copper, and that's it. That's all I got to do. Well, I had a very sage mentor who pointed out to me, well, it's not that simple, because what about your elbows? What about valves? What about the welding that might be required? And blah, blah, blah. And before I knew it, I went from having one single line item from a cost estimate guide for 10 feet of 2-inch copper pipe to have a laundry list of 20 items that built up to a cost that was exponentially higher than just literally taking that 10 foot of pipe and just bring it to the site. Because that's essentially what that was all that was involved. So they do need to be, these resources need to be understood, and they need to be carefully applied. So make sure that you understand the steps that are required to effectively and appropriately use these guides. One of the benefits of using these estimating guides, especially the productivity information that's available and the factors that are embedded in most of these resources in terms of different factors for different geographical locations and whatnot, is being able to set a baseline productivity that then can be used as a comparison point with what actually happened on a project. And it's a source that can be cited, and you can go back and say, look, here's what the industry says should be expected in terms of productivity for this particular scope of work. Here are the impacts that I encountered, and this is what the result of productivity was on this project. And so again, they provide a very sound starting point in terms of what should have been expected. And then we come to a method that we see quite often. It's a very simple method, and we say in part in jest, but not really in jest, that this is probably the most abused method that's out there, and that's the total cost approach. And as I've dealt with this and as I've thought about it in preparation for this presentation, I mean, in my mind, in some cases, it seems it's an approach that's approached like a basic mathematical equation. Here's what I bid the project at. Here's what my actual costs were. I'm going to subtract the two. Owner, here's what I'm entitled to. Well, it's not that simple, and hence it's often abused because it's in the name alone. Total cost it's construed as being exactly that. Hey, my total cost is where I ended up at, and I'm entitled to whatever the delta is. In some situations that's the case, but very rarely is it. And typically, the defense against this really it revolves around lack of a cause and effect connection between the damages and the claimed impacts. And so there are certain hurdles that need to be considered when considering using the total cost approach. First of which is the impracticability of using the other methods that we have mentioned and others that are more accepted. Second, was the work reasonably estimated in the first place? Third, are the actual costs reasonable? And then fourth, is the contractor not responsible for any of the additional costs? Typically what we find is the total cost approach really is more appropriately, I guess, categorized as a modified total cost approach, which is, it's an adjustment to the total cost because it takes into account some of those things that I just went through in terms of the hurdles that are expected to be overcome. And typically, there are corrections that need to be done to the estimate because there's some unreasonable element of the bid estimate. Or contractor, they had some issues of their own that weren't the responsibility of the owner. We back those costs out. And so it paints a much more compelling picture in terms of here's my total costs, here are the deducts that I've taken out that aren't the responsibility of another party, that I'm accepting responsibility for. And after that's been deducted out, here's my claim for additional costs, hence the modified total cost. So again, it's a very simple method, but there needs to be careful consideration in the way that it's prepared and that it's presented, so that it's not something that's being abused. And with that, we'll pivot to supply chain impacts.
Okay, thanks, Barrett. So, yeah, we've moving from productivity to supply chain impacts. We've touched upon this early in the presentation, but as you restart and as you plan for getting back to work, the supply chain impacts are going to be a critical concern. The productivity impacts are going to affect cost and the time of work, and that needs to be put into your schedule, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But supply chain issues need to be looked at very closely, and those impacts need to be inserted into the schedule so you have a realistic look at what you're facing to restart your project. So with that said, some of the impacts to consider, and we talked about these a little bit, but supplier or vendor solvency. I mean, if you've got someone that you contracted with for work on the project, you need to double check with them now to make sure that they're still able to perform, number one, perform, number two, perform timely, and number three, perform at the same cost that they anticipated pre-COVID. So you've got to actively search out those components. It's not going to be enough to say you hold a subcontractor or a supplier to their bid price at this point. There's going to be impacts from COVID, and in order for a general contractor to get a good look at what's going forward, you need to elicit that information from the stakeholders that are supporting your project. For materials or components like steel or equipment, where it was the manufacturing cycle disrupted. So are we going to be able to get steel at the same rate as we anticipated? Need to find that out. Again, with equipment, depending on where it's coming from, domestically or internationally, there may be some issues with getting that to the site. You may be able to get it, but there may be increased fabrication costs or increased material costs. You need to flesh them out and understand how that's going to impact your work, because the owner is going to want to know what that impact is. Depending on the pro forma for a project and the stage of the project, the impacts of COVID may cause an owner to say, you know what, I'm going to mothball this project, but they can't know that until they have input on what the actual impact, what the cost of the impact is going to be. And delivery issues are going to be significant. Physical deliveries to the site. Maybe you're getting partial deliveries. Maybe they're late. How often are you going to be able to receive material at the site? There's a lot of different aspects of that. Now, if your suppliers are no longer available, you need to source out new ones, and you're probably not going to be able to get them at the original cost that you anticipated. That needs to get dealt with. And then PPE availability, that's going to be something that's has been a factor going forward. Hopefully the supply chain is going to be a little more robust with that, but that's definitely an impact for going forward. So I think that pretty much is good for supply chain. So let's pivot now to project schedule changes. So this is late or last in the the deck, because this is the accumulation of a lot of impacts. Because you've got productivity and supply chain that are going to be the drivers that affect, your schedule update, your rescheduling of the job. And truly, this is a rescheduling of the job. The project impacts should be dictating your project schedule, not the other way around. As I mentioned earlier, there's, owners want their projects done on time. Contractors want to make that happen. But we're dealing with some uncharted territory here, and the knowledge base that you currently have about working around problems is probably not robust enough. These are impacts that we have. It's the black swan event. You haven't lived through this before, so you really don't know the impacts. You need to look closely at them so you can provide the input needed to really effectively update your schedule. So the stakeholders and all the stakeholders are involved here. I mean, the contractor is likely driving the schedule, and it's incumbent upon the contractor to get all the inputs, but it needs to be complete and concise so everyone knows the game plan going forward. As I mentioned, reconfirm your commitments to suppliers, subs, and internally. Revisit your activity durations. They're going to change. Your sequence of work may change. It's probably going to change. Means and methods may change. So you're really looking at a rescheduling of the project. And in doing that, in rescheduling the project, you're going to be looking for areas to mitigate, because there is that duty to mitigate these impacts. So you can't mitigate what you don't know. And if you don't, so you really did, make best efforts to identify all the impacts, get them in your schedule, and then from there say, well, how can we work around this? Can we throw on a night shift to help buy back some of that time, to mitigate some of that impact? And then, from there, from that baseline, a rebaseline, if you will, you need to, work that plan to completion. But you're not if we don't have a cogent and realistic schedule going forward, you're really setting yourself up for a bit of failure going forward. And as you make these changes to the schedule, it's important that you include detail as to why. I mean, the ability is there to provide notes, provide reasons for the changes to the schedule, and to substantiate the reasonableness of the change. So, and COVID changes may not be the only ones. In the downtime that is carried on from the suspensions, there may be other bits of information that became known, or you may have found a way to be more efficient. But all that needs to be added into the schedule and documented. Changes need to be realistic, and again, as I mentioned earlier, avoid overpromising based on the desire to get these projects done, and the pressure to get them done based to the original timeline. So it's really important that the updating, rebaselining of the schedule be very detailed and provide for all the impacts that and be updated going forward with impacts that become known over time. So with that, I can move to some of the more specifics on changes to the schedule and updates to the schedule. So Barrett, why don't you take over here?
Some of the practical matters when it comes to schedule changes and updates. A few specific considerations that we often see are overlooked. One includes procurement activities, particularly those that are performed in a factory or shop setting before anything even gets to the site. First, check with your vendors, your subcontractor suppliers. see if there's any updates that need to be made to the delivery projections. And in particular, focus on some of the items that are just, they're known for being susceptible to impacts, and structural steel, curtain wall fabricators we already touched on, whether or not a fabrication slot has been forfeited or not because of the issues of COVID-19. Take a close look at any long lead items and communicate with the parties that are involved to make sure you have appropriate projections. And then, based on that, consider enhancing the level or improving the level of detail in the schedule and including specific activities. Even if the work isn't being performed in the field, it contributes to the overall completion of the project. So make sure there isn't a step that's being overlooked. Shop drawings. We've touched on a little bit about how the approval and review and approval process has been impacted. There may be impacts on shop drawing activities as well. And this is another area that we typically see is shortchanged in the schedule. So revisit it and see what a project restart has done, whether or not shop drawings need to be restarted or additional time dedicated to accomplish those tasks. Then when it comes to construction activity, Charlie already touched on this, review your durations, particularly those for any changes due to COVID-19 impacts. And we recommend that new separate activities be included in the schedule for any additional impacts, but most specifically COVID-19 impacts. Using a common activity ID number is a good practice, along with activity codes, so that the COVID-19 specific impacts can be segregated out and pulled out from the schedule and analyzed as a subset in and of themselves. Other considerations when it comes to the logic, so how the different activities are tied together and their relationships needs to be reviewed and possibly modified. You think about social distancing and the impact that might have on the ability to overlap workers and trades. Get a little bit, technical here in terms of whether there was a start to start or a finish to finish relationship. They may need to be changed to a finish to start. So as opposed to two activities being able to be performed concurrently, you may not be able to do that anymore because of space constraints. You may have to move so that activity B now is following activity A. I mean, just there in that simple example alone points to the importance of really taking a look at the way that the schedule has been constructed and the way the activities have been connected together. Critical path. This is the longest path through a project that dictates when the project's going to be completed. It's important to look at both your critical path as a contractor, but then also the overall critical path. But I would just say as a word of caution to anyone who is subject to a general contractor or somebody else who's been designated as a scheduler for a project, you need to be very, I guess, protective of your piece of the schedule in terms of whatever your critical path is, in the sense that you don't allow others to tell you, well, I'm not concerned about your needs. I'm just looking out for the overall project needs. Yes, your schedule, your part of the schedule contributes to the overall completion of the project, but you also need to be looking out for your interests as well in terms of maintaining the slot that you have within the overall schedule. And then the importance of having a narrative report, right? So all the bars and the charts, the graphs and everything else is all fine and good, but a schedule graphic that's accompanied by a narrative that's concise and to the point always is beneficial. And after the fact, especially being able to go back to a document like that is very helpful. Schedules are meant to be a forecasting tool. How many times have we seen a schedule that's up on a wall and it hasn't been updated since it was issued as a baseline? Too many. So make sure to use it as a forecasting tool, and that requires periodically changing it and updating it in terms of impacts. There's some very general steps that can be taken to quickly and easily update a schedule. First, creating subset activities, as we mentioned before, that's made up of those activities specific to an impact, called Fragment. You insert that into your schedule and connect it to the base contract work that's in the schedule to see what the overall impact might be. And then, quantifying the impact of any on both, again, the contract and the overall schedule, not allowing yourself to be lost in the overall picture per se.
Barrett, one thing just on the schedule, and I got a question that popped up, but it's certainly I think one that I've heard before. And just for everyone listening, it looks like we're going to go a little bit over on time, but we'll try and get to questions. But afterwards, we can certainly get questions as well. But what about the reverse situation? One of the things that maybe occurred with a school job or whatever it may be, all of a sudden, instead of having a phased situation or one where you're restricted on schedule, but you've opened it up and therefore you can get more productivity. How do you balance out the two and make sure you're segregating the both the negative impact and potentially the positive impact?
I think that's a very good scenario to bring up, Joe, especially when it comes to school projects. Before jumping on that bandwagon, thinking that there's a real advantage that can be taken in terms of being able to really jump on a project like a school where there's no longer activity at the school and you can get all this work done. Well, communication first and foremost is key. Talking with those who are involved with the administration of the school, they may not be equipped to accept the school back, maybe weeks or months earlier than had been anticipated. So there might be financial ramifications and also staffing ramifications on the ultimate owner of a facility and receiving a project earlier than had been anticipated. There are others, although, who would be more than happy to get their project done quicker because they don't have those same kind of constraints. So it's important to talk with the different stakeholders, especially the end user of a facility or a building, to see what some of the non-construction related impacts might be before going full bore with an accelerated program to take advantage of, say, more less fettered access to a site or to a building.
And then Joe, to your question about being able to separate out any benefit from an earlier start versus the impacts from COVID, if the schedule is updated appropriately with notations about the adjustments to those various components, then the schedule will drive what the impact is. If there was a gain based on an earlier start, then that will be balanced out in the schedule versus impact from COVID. So it all goes back to the specificity of the schedule input that will then drive, what the resulting impact was.
Right here, we just touch on the importance of you have this schedule that's been updated, it's been changed, it's incorporated the impacts of COVID-19. What good does it do if it's not updated, it's not maintained? So it's critical to update and maintain the schedule. Contracts usually have some kind of requirement regarding the maintenance of schedules. Don't be beholden to that limit necessarily. It might make sense, for example, whereas the contract says update the schedule every month on a monthly basis, that you're doing it on a weekly basis internally so you can get out in front of the effects of impacts and be able to forecast out. Again, it's easier to deal with the potential impact or potential effect of an impact than it is retroactively go back and try to deal with the effects. So make sure that there's a regular, consistent cadence in terms of updating the schedule. And just one last thing here in terms of schedule maintenance, maintain the activity IDs and the descriptions, because once those get changed, comparing one update to the next is very difficult and challenging if changes are made to those fundamental elements of an activity. So again, it's a very technical point, but it is one nonetheless it's important to keep in mind when looking down the road in terms of using the project schedule as a forecasting and as a measuring tool for impact. Some are probably saying, why isn't this at the beginning and why didn't you spend like an hour and a half talking about the cost impacts? Well, we just got a few minutes, but this is ultimately what we're talking about. What is the monetary effect of these impacts? I would just say, don't let indirect costs be lost in the midst of direct costs. Some of these costs are some of the biggest ticket items on a project. We talk about project management staff, site maintenance, home office overhead. So it's important to track those and track them very carefully and not let them get lost in the mix of what's going on in the field. And then again, we've hit on this a few times, but the importance of setting up separate codes, particular charge codes for COVID-19 impact costs, so that they can easily be segregated and pulled out and used in whatever analysis follows. And then just gratuitous comment here, consult with the appropriate experts and legal counsel on any kind of rules or conditions that may apply. Contractors, you're in the business of getting jobs done. And we know that this sometimes is just minutia. And in some cases, it's $1 well spent to have somebody else come in, a third set of eyes to take a look. And not only a third set of eyes, but also someone who does this day in and day out with the kind of perspective that most experts do have, having seen it before, and can really lend a tremendous benefit to helping you push forward these claims, especially when it comes to costs. And so now some considerations on future projects.
Okay, well, future projects. Well, I mean, we're not going to spend a heck of a lot of time here because it really is just taking the impacts that we know that are coming and using those to adjust, bidding on future projects. So there's going to be the impacts that we know are coming, and implementing those into your bidding of future projects. But also, what we've also seen is changes to contract provisions. Owners are making changes to contract provisions around the COVID reality. So you need to relook at those contract clauses to see what's been added and what the provisions may not be as favorable as they otherwise would be. Some of those risks are going to be shoved downstream, and you need to know that before you rebid your next project. Again, this is a black swan event, and we don't know how long it's going to hang on, but who knows whether it will surface again in the future. So there's no silver bullet here, but a baseline for starting is understanding what the impacts are currently, and then taking those to give some forecast as to what they're going to be going forward. But it has to be eyes wide open, because this is the elephant in the room. So just to close up here, some of the key takeaways. I think we've pounded these things home pretty emphatically as we've gone through here. But all stakeholders are feeling this pain. So we need to have communication with all stakeholders, and seek appropriate assistance. Your accountant, your lawyer, consultants, your insurance broker. I mean, these are all players that can help and provide guidance to deal with this. I mean, it's a heavy enough lift just to get projects done and profitable. When you add this on top of it, it adds another level of complexity that no one has anticipated. Timely identification and communication of impacts is key, and document. We can't emphasize strongly enough that without key and competent and comprehensive documentation, it's going to be difficult to prove impact. Segregate your COVID impacts. You can't just throw them all in a box, throw all the ills of a project in a box and say, give me relief because of COVID. It doesn't work that way. Update your impacts on an ongoing basis, and keep your eyes wide open for the future. With that, I think we can go to Q&A. We are a bit over time, but I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about this subject today. Joe.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This was very good and very comprehensive. We've had some questions that I've kind of incorporated in throughout. But if there are other questions, and Brendan or Mike, I'll let you kind of manage the logistics of folks raising their hands and asking a question. If you have to jump off, this is being recorded, and certainly send me an email, and we can try and get the question answered subsequently. So with that, any questions?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Joe. It's Brendan, it's Mike. I forgot who I am. That's not a good sign. Yeah, there are a couple questions, folks. If you've got a question, either raise your hand using the function within the chat window here in Zoom, or you can type it into the chat. We have a question from, and then either Brendan or I will unmute you, but our first question is from Larry Prosen. Larry, you are unmuted. Go right ahead. Are you there, Larry? Nope, hang on. Larry?
That may.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry, guys. I think, hey, Charlie, how are you?
I'm well, Larry. You?
Match your beard with mine, so there you go. I was just trying to get some insight in how you guys have been advising clients. I know you talked a little bit before from the legal perspective. I've spent the last 8 or 9 weeks advising clients on compensability, particularly with regard to in New York. There were a lot of changes with regard to the different stop work orders. Originally it was mostly essential, then transit type work. I was curious what you guys have seen with regard to particularly commercial jobs where there wasn't really a stop work order in place, but the owner said, we want you guys to stop. I've taken the position that is a compensable delay, that there's no legal requirement, that we are allowed, our clients are allowed to continue performance. I was kind of curious what you guys have seen with regard to that.
I haven't heard a lot in that space, and quite frankly, Larry, when I would get anything like that, I would probably point them to legal counsel, because that is the L part of the liability causation and damages arena. But we've had we've had some input from contractors that are dealing with projects that were restarted and really wanting to be aggressively going after them to get them done as soon as possible. And the key here is you don't overpromise, and I think it really comes down to understanding how these projects have changed, and only then can you really do any kind of forecasting on what you're going to be able to accomplish. So it's really going to take some time to push through this, and I think that contractors are going to be able to use their estimating resources a little bit heavier, their scheduling resources to make sure that they have implemented schedules all the known impacts. But as far as owner driver impacts that haven't come up, I'm sure it's going to be.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Marilyn Marr. Marilyn, you're unmuted. You there, Marilyn? Oh, Marilyn has no microphone, so I will pose the question for her. How about that? Marilyn asks, for future projects, do you have any suggested provisions to add to any new contracts?
I'm sure Larry does. I mean, that really, the contractual side of things is really something that I typically hand off to, we would typically hand off to legal counsel. But I think that the fact that there needs to be dialogue, and I think between stakeholders, if you're discussing what the impacts are openly, I think you can, get to a reasonable point. But I think it's a little still too fresh to start talking about the contract clause changes. I know that their owners are pushing contract clauses downstream a bit for including pandemic-related impacts in future contracts. So all I can say is, once we know more about the extent and duration of some of these impacts, I think we'd be in a better position to suggest changes to contract provisions, but it's a little too fresh in my mind right now, unless Larry or the legal side have heard more in that regard.
I would just to point people, if you haven't already seen the previous webinar on April 1st, it was a pretty stacked panel of attorneys who deal in construction, and they go through pretty thoroughly different clauses that should be reviewed and reconsidered. So I would recommend going back and looking there, Marilyn, as a start to consider what steps to take from there.
Yeah, it's Mike. I believe that's posted on our website at agcmys.org/coronavirus. So you can find that webinar as well as all the other ones that we've been doing since this started right there.
And one other thing that I would note, Marilyn, the event or the program at 2 o'clock for the members on the new guidance, there will be some contractual issues that I think come immediately to mind, relative to delegating certain responsibilities and what those impacts are. I think are going to be key, not only for current projects, but I think going forward in contracts in that regard. I think, and I think it becomes even more complicated when you have multiple prime contracts. But there are also going to be considerations I think needed downstream with subcontracts. This is very fresh. So as Charlie said, there's still a lot to digest in this regard, but I think there are things that are going to have to be considered.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I have a question from Jim Hughes. Jim, your microphone is on. Go right ahead.
Hey, everybody. Appreciate it. First of all, thank you for the excellent presentation. I can't stress to everybody enough the importance of putting your impact analyses together now in presenting them to the owners in real time. If you do that, you're showing that you're being candid, you're showing that you're being prepared, and your owners are going to be much more responsive to addressing these claims in good faith. That usually means talking to folks like GREYHAWK, because they can guide you as you have your staff do the work internally. And if you do it that way, what you might find is you'll save yourself many times the expense of doing it up front. Of course, the hard part is it means getting your in-house staff focused and to get this kind of work done. And it's hard work to do, but it's necessary overhead if you're going to get compensated for these claims. Thank you. Was that a question, by the way?
Good point.
Thank you, Jim.
I am not seeing any other questions at this point. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up? I guess not.
All right. Well, thank you very much for participating in this, and Charlie and Barrett. It's a great presentation, and really want to thank you for putting it on and being a great resource, for us, GREYHAWK, like other of our associate members, have become invaluable, like the lawyers on the earlier program, and so we really appreciate their time and effort.
We have a hand up. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Jorge, go right ahead. Your microphone's on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for Charles on the schedule. How are we going to handle the float to calculate the impacts of the force majeure?
Yep. Good question, Jorge. Hope things are well in Rochester. It's going to be driven by the schedule. You're going to be putting impacts into the schedule, and float is there for the benefit of the project. That's argued sometimes, but it's there for the benefit of the project. So to the extent that float is eaten up by COVID, there's a strong argument that that belongs to the project. But that would be my initial reaction to that question.
Yeah, and I would just add too, Jorge, it's important to look at the contract. Some of the more, I guess, schedule-rich contracts, I guess I would call it, they actually address float and who owns it and how it's to be addressed. So I would definitely look there as well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Joe.
You're muted, Joe. Joe, you're muted.
Sorry.
That's it.
Thank you, everyone. I think Brendan probably within 24 hours will be sending out information for the recording and the PowerPoint slides. But in any event, that will be posted on our on the special coronavirus portion of our website. And so stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more programs. And for those of you who are going to be on the call at 2 o'clock, we look forward to talking then. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the
Thank you,
opportunity.
everyone. Be well.
Bye.